Chapter 10. Bracing the Storm. Glenn was glad of the thick Harris tweed overcoat as he made his way around the outskirts of the courtyard. The biting chill of the wintry gusts of wind that whipped across his face was bad enough to make him grit his teeth. He had elected not to go straight to the tents covering the blood-spattered areas, hoping that they would remain intact during the storm, which was now almost upon them. His gut was telling him that if he didn't cast an eye around the perimeter, a vital clue would be swept away by the maelstrom. Inquisitive feet had undoubtedly already walked this path in search of clues. Nevertheless, he felt sure that another look would not be in vain. He could sense the cold gaze of Jim from high up on the ramparts bearing down upon him. A gaze he knew would be questioning why Glenn felt that he would find something that others had not. Glenn ignored the icy look and continued to press on. He was about 3/4 of the way round the quadrangle and was on the verge of giving up. Overhead, the first battalions of storm clouds had commenced their assault on the outlying fortifications of the mount. Huge sheets of rain lashed down against the stonework, whilst wave after wave of white horses surging across the blackening sea below flung themselves towards the granite cliffs with such force that when they finally crashed into the rock, the Atlantic wave riders were sent tumbling high into the air, breaching the walls, just like the fearless jockeys on furlong-weary mounts colliding headlong into Beecher's Brook, catapulted across that most infamous of high hurdles. So great was the power of the onslaught that Glenn could feel the floor of the courtyard shudder with vibrations as every fresh charge of Poseidon's cavalry, spurred on by his trident, smashed against the fortress. Glenn had become so distracted by the immensity of the storm's impact that he almost fell flat on his face, tripping over something that had become wedged into a seam between two slabs. Just proud of the flagstones. Managing to regain his balance before hitting the ground, he almost ignored whatever had caused his wrong-footedness, putting his near miss down to his haste to find some cover from the raging storm. Nevertheless, his natural reaction was to quickly glance back at the area in question. It was a reflex reaction, more out of curiosity as to what it could have been that had caught him out, and to hopefully get a small peace of mind that he hadn't just clumsily tripped over his own feet. His figure standing tall between the area and the bright work lights cast a long solitary shadow over the cold wet stones. In the very moment that he glanced back, a sudden gust of wind caused one of the work lights behind to topple over onto the ground, and as it hit the ground, its beam lit up the area. He would never have noticed the twinkle of a small metallic fragment indefinitely stuck between a joint in the time-weathered paving had it not been for the domino effect of the falling lamp. It could have just been another spent bullet casing, but he didn't give it a second thought. In his current frame of mind, any fresh evidence, however trivial, could potentially help with the case. He spun on his heels, and strolling over to the object, he carefully eased it from its temporary prison with the aid of a biro from inside his coat pocket. To his delighted surprise, the object was not as insignificant as just another piece of virtually untraceable ammunition, but was in fact the remnants of what may have once been a ring. His heart leapt with joy as he recalled the conversation with Jim earlier that night. Could it be, he thought, that I might have found the missing ring and a significant piece of the puzzle? His satisfaction was short-lived. Due to the amount of water pouring out of the sky, he couldn't make out much of the detail. He quickly dropped his prize into an evidence bag, making a mental note of roughly where it was in the courtyard, just in case it turned out to be another dead end, and he hurriedly dashed off back toward the shelter of the chapel, where he could examine the object more closely. Wiping some of the water out of his hair and eyes, the junior detective, that now resembled a wet sponge, had almost reached the peacefulness of the chapel as the storm continued to rage around him. He was on the verge of crossing the threshold when he was almost bowled over by the express train-like figure of Becky running at full steam in the opposite direction. Fortunately, she had seen him at the last second and managed to apply the brakes, so that instead of a full-on wreck, they just bumped each other. Typical gung-ho attitude. Do you ever look where you're going? Don't answer that. Glenn, you need to come and help us. We need to get these tents anchored now, she pleaded, pointing to the tents on the far side of the courtyard, already straining at their guy ropes. Otherwise they're going to be swept away. We never expected this storm to be so big. But I've just found something that might be really important. You've bagged it, right? Of course. Then it'll still be there later, whereas the tents will not. And if they go, all the evidence they are protecting goes with them. So come on, you need to help, now, she snapped at him. There was no time for pleading. This was a full-on command, and she was not in the mood to wait for an answer. But, Glenn began to reply. However, before he'd had time to finish his sentence, Becky had already grabbed him by the arm and began pulling him off towards the tents on the far side of the swamped courtyard. At first he dragged his feet. He had the overwhelming desire to inspect what he'd just found, and yet he understood the ramifications of not helping to secure the tents. He was torn between heart and head. In the end, he gave in to her constant pulling and allowed himself to be dragged away from the chapel. By the time they'd crossed the courtyard, most of the Socko team on the mount were already making vain attempts to reinforce the anchor points to one tent, whilst others were desperately hanging on to another by the only guy rope that remained in place. Try as they might, the majority of the tent was already acting more like a kite on the end of a control line than something designed to be on the ground. The danger lay in trying to catch hold of the other guys that had broken free. They swirled and whipped about with every fresh gust, metal stakes still in the end loops. Many of those on the ground were cautious in getting too close, in case they were on the verge of receiving the end of a scorpion-like blow. Glenn could see them struggle, and witnessed the first few bags of evidence gradually being blown from the tables underneath the flying canvas. It was at that moment he decided to act. Keep hold of that line. And when I say pull, pull like your lives depend on it, he shouted at the Sockos. He didn't really have a perfect plan, but he knew what had to be done, and it was clear that he would just have to suck it up and get the job done. The wind continued to swirl and buffet the walls of the fortress. The wave surges were now so huge that great plumes of spray now easily cleared the height of the outer fortifications. This, combined with the volume of rain that continued to pour down from the heavens, meant that the feet of those in the courtyard were now swimming in water. The decorative gargoyle heads high up on the walls that had up until now coped quite well with dealing with the volume of water were finally overcome. No longer was there just a constant jet-like stream spouting from their mouths. Now each one had spurted a white mane as the pressure of the water became so great that excess burst around their heads. Now, Glenn shouted as loud as he could, in order to be heard above the din pitching around him. Pull, for fuck's sake, pull! As the group began to take up the strain, like a tug-of-war team against a far superior odds, grapples with the rope, he ran and launched himself towards one of the flailing guys. He kept his arms up around his face until the very last possible moment to protect the most important parts from the rogue metal stakes thrashing around in mid-air. Then he snatched at the guy rope as gravity began to take hold of him once more. He caught it and held on for dear life. At first the tent tried to wriggle free, tossing and turning in the whirlwinds, trying anything to buck the additional weight dragging it down, but he held on. He felt a sharp pain in his side as one of the other barbed tendril-like guys lashed out, but he clung on, and as the constant gravitational pull took hold, the tent now being pulled down in two directions could no longer maintain its unauthorized inaugural flight, and just like a broken parachute, collapsed back down to earth, landing right on top of, from the tent's perspective, the wrecker of its newfound source of freedom. Glenn lay on the ground for a few moments, taking stock of his sudden act of recklessness. His side burned, but he was too tired after wrestling with the tent to inspect what damage he'd taken in his efforts to bring the tent to heel. "Shit, Glenn, you okay?" the voice of Becky called out to him from the other side of the canvas. "Yeah, I think so," he replied from his position under the now lifeless tent. "Any chance of getting this thing off me?" A few of the sockos lifted the canvas from him, taking great care not to allow it to catch the breeze and relaunch itself back into the billowing airflows. Getting to his feet, Glenn's first reaction was to check his pocket for the evidence bag, which contained the ring. "Shit, don't tell me it's fallen out." He cursed as it dawned on him that it might have fallen out and been blown away during his tussle with the tent. Fuck, that's all I need. Fucking great. "Lost something?" the now familiar voice of Becky asked behind him. "Yeah, the evidence I bagged just before you dragged me off over here." "You mean this evidence bag?" she asked as she smugly held up and waved the small polythene bag in front of him. "Becky, you're a legend. If I wasn't married, I could kiss you right about now." "Where'd you find it?" "Whoa, slow down there, Tiger," she replied with just a hint of sarcasm resonating in her voice. "I noticed it slip out when you were halfway off the ground, so thought I'd better grab it before it was swept away with the rest of the evidence." "Thanks, you're a lifesaver." His relief was clearly evident across his face that it hadn't been lost along with the other bags from the tent. "You got a magnifying glass in that kit of yours?" he asked as he was about to head back to the chapel. You're not going anywhere, mister. Not before we get that wound of yours sorted," Becky said, pointing to the area on Glenn's tweed coat that was now soaked in blood. "Oh, come on, it's just a scratch. I'll be fine." "No, this needs to be treated." "Seriously, can we do it later?" "Seriously, no. This needs to get sorted before you do anything else. It's not going to take long. There's a med kit in one of the tents. Well, at least there used to be. See, it might not even be there. It can wait. Glenn, don't be so pig-headed. We're going to dress this one way or another before you do anything else." "Fine, I can see I'm not going to win on this one," he said, conceding the point. "Charlie," Becky called out to one of the other sockos near the main evidence tent that had managed to weather the storm, "can you fetch the medikit? Got a wounded policeman that requires some attention." "Yeah, pretty sure it's still on the bench," he replied as he darted into the tent to return a few seconds later with the green box. "You're not doing it out here, are you? It's pissing it down out here. By the time you've put that on, it may as well come straight off again. Can't we do it in the chapel where at least it's dry?" "Determined to look at that evidence, aren't you? But yes, I suppose you're right, it would be best done undercover." Becky reluctantly gave in to his request. She admired his dedication to work, but wasn't quite so impressed by his foolhardy approach. "Right, top off. she said as they entered the chapel. What? Well, I'm not going to dress it while you've still got that jacket and shirt on, am I? Come on, trust me, I've seen enough half-naked bodies in my time. Thank God the wife isn't here, that's all I can say. I think the word less than pleased would be a PC description. I'm sure, especially if she's seen you're endangering yourself in such a manner. Come on, top off. Alright, if it stops your moither, let's get it done. Honestly, you're as bad as my mother, he replied, as he begrudgingly slipped off his overcoat, pulling his shirt off his head, over his head, to reveal his tanned, rippling upper body. Very nice. Certainly don't get to see that every day. Enjoying yourself, are we? I swear, you're just doing it to wind me up. Well, not every day a girl gets to see that, so may as well make the most of it. She joked as she pulled out a large dressing to wind around his midriff. So opportunistic. You know, this is bordering on harassment. Oh, behave, she replied as she finished wrapping the dressing around his lower abdomen, fixing it in place with a couple of safety pins. All done. See, that wasn't so bad, was it? For you, maybe. Right, I believed you promised me a magnifying glass. Unlike the coffee that was promised hours ago and as of yet has failed to materialize. I'm hoping it will actually appear. We're a little cranky tonight, aren't we? I know I left it somewhere around here. Do you want a left or a right-handed one? Now you're taking the piss. Alright. Jesus. Not really the banter type, are you? Anyway, what are you hoping to find? It's only a ring, Becky asked as she rummaged around in her forensic kit. Jim mentioned to me that the body had a ring line, so I'm hoping this may be the ring in question. With some luck, it might have some latent prints on it. Ah, that would be really good. Definitely short on those at the moment. Yeah, tell me about it. There you go, she said, passing him a magnifying glass from her case. You take a look while I sort out some print powder. Is that ring silver? Looks like it. In that case, might have to nip over to the supply tent. Don't think I've got quite the right one in my case to give the best results. Be back in a bit. Thanks, Beck. You're a good girl, really. Not true what they say about you. Pardon? What was that? Oh, now who can't take a bit of banter? Glenn replied with a wry smile. I'll let you have that one, she replied as she turned on her heels, still muttering something about typical men that Glenn didn't quite catch. See you in a bit, he called out after her departing figure. Glenn was like a little kid unwrapping a birthday present as he tore open the evidence bag and took out the small silver signet ring. Blowing the excess water from it, he began to inspect the worn and battered engraving around its bezel. Even under the bright work lights that Becky had set up in the chapel, it was difficult to make out exactly what the graving was, partially down to the wear and tear of everyday use, and also because of the large scratches that it had no doubt picked up as it had bounced across the flagstones after plummeting from the height of the upper ramparts. Nevertheless, Glenn could make out what appeared to be a squirrel standing upright on a log. The squirrel was clutching something between its outstretched forepaws, although the damage to this part of the ring is obscured exactly what the prized possession was. There was also what appeared to be a Maltese cross resting on the upper back of the squirrel, with its tail curling into the centre of the cross. Glenn also saw that the shoulders of the ring had been engraved with the words Veritas et Spes, which he presumed was a family motto of some sort. He knew that it was a tradition of so many English families with ancient lineages to wear and pass down their family emblems. He was still trying to work out what the squirrel had clenched between its paws when Becky returned with the fingerprint powder. Having any luck? Well, sort of. I can make out most of it. There's a squirrel and I think some kind of Maltese cross. The squirrel's holding something, but I can't make out what it is. And a bit of an inscription, Latin, I guess, but not sure as I've never seen the language before. Sure it's not a nut? She suggested with a hint of sarcasm. I was sort of thinking that, but I just can't tell, he replied, ignoring the sarcasm. What do you think? He continued, handing the ring and the magnifying glass to her. Yeah, I see what you mean. It has received a fair few knocks to that part. I wouldn't like to guess either. It could be something. I doubt it belonged to the body, if it does prove to be Jackson Torben. Oh, why'd you say that? He anxiously asked, as he took in her latest statement that seemed to pour water onto the flicker of hope that he'd had since finding it. Well, because it isn't the coat of arms or emblem of the St. Alban family. They have some sort of black bird standing on a rock wearing a white sash. Can't remember what the motto is, but it's definitely not theirs. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Fuck, I just can't get a break on this case. Look, it might belong to someone else who was here, or it could be something connected to the family. That I don't know. I'm just saying it's not their coat of arms. I wouldn't give up hope just yet. What's the inscription again? Veritas et Space? Do you know Latin or whatever this is? Of course, had it when I was doing my training. Let me think. Veritas et Space. Well, veritas means truth. Et is obviously and. Obviously, Glenn muttered under his breath. He hated it when someone knew more about things than him. Becky frowned slightly at the comment, but refrained from commenting and continued with